Welcome to the Daily's News Currents. Today is November 11th, and for today's headlines we have: the White House will be shedding its union label. This elephant uses a hose to give herself a shower every day. With DNA, Pompeii narratives take a twist. Bobby Allison, one of the all-time great NASCAR drivers, has died at age 86. And 13 states will have women governors next year, a new record. The White House will be shedding its union label. After gains by organized labor under President Biden, a second Trump administration is likely to change course on regulation and enforcement. Joseph R. Biden Jr. promised to be the most pro-labor president in history. He embraced unions more overtly than his predecessors in either party and filled his administration with union supporters. Labor seemed to be responded accordingly. Filings for unionization elections spiked to their highest level in a decade, as did union victories. There were breakthroughs at companies like Starbucks and Amazon, and unions prevailed in organizing a major foreign auto plant in the South. A united automobile workers' walkout yielded substantial contract gains, and images of Mr. Biden joining a picket line. As Donald J. Trump prepares to retake the White House, labor experts expect the legal landscape for labor to turn sharply in the other direction. Based on Mr. Trump's first term and his comments during the campaign, including his praise for Tesla's chief executive, Elon Musk, for what he said was Mr. Musk willingly to fire striking workers, these experts say the new administration is likely to bring fewer challenges to employees who fight unions. There will be a concerted effort to repeal pro-worker NLRB precedents, said Heidi Scherzholz, a senior Labor Department official during the Obama administration, referring to the National Labor Relations Board. Experts like Ms. Scherzholz, who is now president of the Liberal Economic Policy Institute, said that they expected that the Trump administration to ease up on enforcing safety rules, to narrow eligibility for overtime pay, and to make it harder for gig workers to gain status as employees. A Trump transition spokesman did not respond to requests for comment. Labor unions generally backed Vice President Kamala Harris in the recent election, but a few prominent ones, like the International Brotherhood of Teamsters and the International Association of Firefighters, stayed neutral after endorsing Democratic presidential candidates in the past. It is unclear whether the neutrality will yield more influence for these unions in the new administration. The NLRB may be the agency that swings sharply most quickly. The General Counsel prosecutes labor law violations, and its 5-member board decides questions of legal doctrine, a kind of high court for labor issues. Mr. Biden fired the agency's General Counsel shortly after taking office and installed a replacement more in sync with his priorities. Mr. Trump is likely to do the same, which would mean ousting Jennifer Abruzzo, who has aggressively wielded the powers of her office on behalf of workers seeking to unionize. Ms. Abruzzo has sought increased financial remedies for workers who are fired for organizing and has taken action against companies for holding mandatory meetings that highlight the downsides of unionizing. If Mr. Trump's first term is a guide, his appointee as general counsel will probably adopt an approach that makes it harder for union campaigns to succeed. His appointees to the Labor Board will probably reverse Biden-era rulings on high-profile issues, including one allowing the board to order recognition of a union if the employer makes a fair election impossible, such as by firing workers who seek to unionize. The Trump Labor Board will probably also undo a decision that largely struck down the use of gag rules in severance agreements, according to Marshall Babson, a lawyer who works with management and served on boards in the 1980s. These agreements generally prevent workers from describing unsafe working conditions or sexual harassment at their former workplace. It could make it easier for large companies to avoid recognizing and bargaining with unions formed by employees of contractors or franchises like Amazon and its delivery drivers, some of whom have recently unionized. All would be consistent with Mr. Trump's earlier approach as president. Such changes may also come sooner than usual. Presidents have traditionally left Labor Board members to serve out their terms, which could mean effective Democratic control of the board until at least August 2026. But several experts predicted that Mr. Trump would move to install a Republican majority shortly after taking office, challenging a generally cited legal standard if necessary. A new direction is also expected at the Department of Labor, which enforces minimum wage, overtime, and worker safety rules. Under Mr. Biden, the department substantially increased the number of salaried workers who are eligible for overtime pay by raising the cutoff to about 59,000 next year to about 35,500 under Mr. Trump. It issued a rule making it likelier that gig workers would be classified as employees rather than independent contractors, entitling them to federal minimum wage and overtime pay, and stepped up enforcement on child labor violations. The new administration may rein in overtime eligibility and undo the Biden rule on independent contractors, reflecting Mr. Trump's first-term approach. It is also likely to tamp down enforcement of child labor rules by the Labor Department, which last year instructed officials to seek large monetary penalties from violators. It is hard to believe that a Trump DOL would be pursuing child labor as aggressively as the administration has, said Lee Schreider, a lawyer at the firm Littler Mendelsohn, which represents employees. She said the department has recently asked some of her clients to pay as much larger penalties than employers had paid in the past, including during the first Trump administration. Safety rules could also be affected. Under Mr. Biden, the Department of Occupational Safety and Health Administration proposed requiring employers to protect workers from the health risk of heat exposure by providing drinking water, rest breaks, and sufficient cooling indoors. It sought penalties against Amazon for exposing warehouse workers to ergonomic hazard capable of causing serious physical harm. Amazon appealed the citations. Ann Rosenthal, a longtime OSHA lawyer in Democratic and Republican administrators, said she expected the Trump administration to delay the heat rule, which it can do with little consequence for years. She said she can also expect the agency to curtail investigations of employers in case where the law gives it discretion. But experts say less sympathetic regulators won't necessarily mean a large drop in labor activism, because organizing can develop a momentum of its own. Workers who have seen other workers successfully take on employers often follow suit. A big part of what's been going on is a demonstration effect that this is something we can do, and it's independent of the legal environment, said Barry Eidelin, a sociologist who studies labor at McGill University in Montreal. Workers may simply alter their organizing strategies. For example, graduate students at private universities who have been unionizing in large numbers over the past few years might stop filing paperwork to hold union elections under Mr. Trump. They could fear that its labor board would rule that they have lacked a federal protected right to unionize, as previous Republican labor boards did. Instead, they might seek voluntary recognition from their universities, then protest and perhaps even strike until their universities grant it. There are a lot more people who are going to be saying, "What do you mean you're trying to prevent me from having a union?" Dr. Eidelin said. Something similar could happen at companies, said Michael Lolito of Littler Mendelsohn, an expert on labor relations. He said that unions often pivoted to targeting a company's reputation when the legal landscape became less favorable, and that these campaigns could be effective. A lot of companies make the calculations that we can deal with a union. We can have a strike negotiations. Those are just costs, Mr. Lolito said. But reputational risk is what's gotten their attention. Unions are very good at destroying the reputation. Mr. Trump could prompt activism in less direct ways, too. During his first term, his policies seemed to make protest a more mainstream activity, including for tens of thousands of teachers in states like West Virginia and Oklahoma who walked off the job in 2018. The Trump presidency increased the sense of numbers of people on the street that has knock-on effects for labor, said Charmaine Chua, a political scientist who studies labor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. The red state strikes felt like kind of a symptom of that. This elephant uses a hose to give herself a shower every day. In the Berlin Zoo, Mary demonstrated another example of clever elephantine tool, while using another animal exhibited a form of mischief with a hose that resembled a prank. Elephants are serious about self-care. To stay cool and protect their skin, they wallow in mud, bathe in dust, and use their trunks to spray themselves with water. Now, an Asian elephant named Mary, who lives at the Berlin Zoo, has developed a more advanced technique by using a large hose to give herself a shower. Mary's hose-wielding abilities appears to be the latest example of tool use by animals, researchers say in a paper that was published Friday in the journal Current Biology. Mary is so superb at showering, said Michael Brecht, a neuroscientist at Humboldt University in Berlin and the author of the paper. Mary wasn't the only elephant who proved handy with the hose. A youngster named Anachalali developed 2 different techniques for interrupting the flow of water using the hose, and thus Mary's showers. The observation raises a proactive possibility. By disabling the tool Mary was using, Brecht thinks Anachalali was engaged in a kind of sabotage behavior. Efforts to test this idea were inconclusive, and the researchers disagree over how likely it was that one elephant was effectively pranking another. But the study provides the latest evidence that elephants can use tools and manipulate objects in sophisticated ways. Earlier studies have shown them peeling bananas and using tree branches to swat away flies. While a hose may seem simple to you, for an animal it's very complex, Lena Kaufman, a doctoral student in Dr. Brecht's lab and the author of the paper. But she said an elephant might have a somewhat intuitive understanding for a hose because it's super similar to the trunk. Miss Kaufman initially noticed Mary's showering skills while watching the zookeepers make their morning rounds, using a hose to rinse off each elephant. When they got to Mary, they simply handed her the hose, and she started showering herself, Miss Kaufman said. She really went for all the body parts, Mary caretakers told Miss Kaufman. They had not taught her this behavior. But Mary was the only elephant in the zoo who showered with the hose on her own, they found. Let's watch this video. She also used different showering techniques. To spray her side, she gripped the hose close to the end, using it like a portable shower head, that she directed at different parts of her body. She also coordinated the movements of the hose and her body, swinging a back leg forward as she aimed the hose at it. To rinse off her back, she held the hose farther from the end and swung it like a lasso behind her head. Mary also altered her showering behavior, depending on which hose was at her disposal. When she was at the zoo's normal hose, which was about an inch in diameter, she showered almost exclusively with it, but when presented with a thicker, stiffer hose that was difficult to manipulate, Mary relied more on her trunk. For the purpose of showering, Miss Kaufman said Mary seemed to understand that the bigger, heavier hose was just not as useful. At first, the researchers mostly focused on Mary, but one day while Mary was showering, Anachalali grabbed the middle of the hose, lifted it off the ground, and folded it to form a kink. Then Anachalali changed her grip and squeezed the kink, stopping the water flow. It's a complicated maneuver, and Anachalali got better at it over time, stopping the flow of water for increasingly long periods at the time. What the behavior meant, however, was debated quite a bit in the lab, Dr. Brecht said. Anachalali's behavior emerged shortly after Mary began behaving aggressively towards the youngster. Could the hose kinking be payback? The scientists tried to test this hypothesis by giving Anachalali access to 2 hoses, theorizing that she might prefer to kink the hose that Mary was using, rather than selecting hoses at random. Instead, Anachalali tended to clamp whatever hose was closer. Still, the researchers were reluctant to draw definitive conclusions, noting that they conducted a small number of trials and that caretakers had previously scolded Anachalali for grabbing Mary's hose. For Dr. Brecht, what made the sabotage hypothesis more convincing is that Anachalali also developed a second technique for messing with Mary, using her trunk to press down on the hose until the water stopped flowing. If she invents two behaviors, and they're all very complicated and very purposeful, Dr. Brecht says, my thinking is, it's the best explanation she was trying to sabotage the showering. Mrs. Kaufman is less convinced. I think it's a bit far-fetched, she said. The hose manipulation might have simply been playful exploration, or a bid for attention while the researchers were focused on Mary, with the sour stoppages emerging as an accidental byproduct. But the idea of deliberate interference is worth further investigation, Miss Kaufman said. The behaviors she's performing are leading to the stop of water flow, she said. I cannot tell if that's her plan. With DNA, Pompeii narratives take a twist. In 79 AD, a volcanic eruption engulfed the town's residents. They weren't all who scientists thought newly extracted genetic material suggests. The Italian writer Italo Calvino observed that a person's life consists of a collection of events, the last of which could change the meaning of the whole. In AD 79, the final event of many of the inhabitants of Pompeii was a volcanic eruption that buried them under a 20-foot layer of ash and sediment. Dozens of the corpses retained their shape long enough for the layers of debris to build around them, forming impressions that, with the decaying of soft tissue, became perfect hollow molds. Starting in 1863, archaeologists filled the cavities with plaster to create replicas of the victims' death throes. Narratives were spun around the more evocative cast, a group consisting of a child and two adults, one of whom wore wrist jewelry and whose lap held a youngster, became known as the family of the House of the Golden Bracelet, while a pair of bodies locked in what appeared to be a poignant embrace was famously named the Two Maidens. Now, genomic testing on skeletal remains embedded in the cast has challenged both interpretations. As reported Thursday in the journal Current Biology, the DNA evidence shows that the identities and relationships of the deceased do not match the long-standing assumptions, which have largely been based on physical appearance, the positioning of the cast, and romantic notions promoted by literature and Hollywood films. The study team, which included David Wright, a geneticist at Harvard University, and David Caramelli, an anthropologist at the University of Florence in Italy, proposed that the adult and the younger child, traditionally viewed as mother and offspring, are genetically an adult male and a boy who are biologically unrelated. Contrary to the established account, the researchers concluded that none of the four people in the grouping were kinfolk. We were able to quite clearly disprove what archaeologists have put forth about this group being a nuclear family, said Alicia Mitnick, a geneticist at the Harvard lab that generated the data. But of course we really don't know, and we can't really say who these individuals were and how they interacted with each other. She added, it could have been that these were servants or slaves, or the children might have been the children of servants or slaves who also inhabited the house. Genomic sequencing also showed that at least one of the so-called maidens, presumed to be either sisters or mother and daughter, was in fact a man. There again, we could say that one of them was genetically male, and they were not maternally related to each other, Dr. Mitnick said. She acknowledged that the figures could have been lovers, or given that the adoption was a commonplace in the Roman Empire, especially among the upper classes, they might have considered each other brothers, or even brother and sister. So again, Dr. Mitnick said, a case where the most obvious and most intuitive interpretation was not in fact what we see scientifically. Gabriel Scorano, a University of Copenhagen geneticist who was not involved in the new study, said the findings confirmed and reinforced most of the preliminary analysis of the cast announced in 2017 as part of the Great Pompeii Project, an 8-year program to stabilize and repair the most endangered features of the site. In that initiative, medical imaging debunked several myths about the cast. A CT scan of one known as the pregnant woman revealed that the person was probably not pregnant and might not have been a woman. An array of specialists speculated that bunched-up clothing accounted to the bulge of the belly. They also determined that some of the victims had most likely died from head injuries rather than asphyxiation. An estimated 10% of Pompeii's 20,000 or so inhabitants perished when Mount Vesuvius erupted. The first systematic excavations, began only in 1748 and proceeded slowly until 1860, when archaeologist Giuseppe Forelli was put in charge. It was Forelli who pioneered the technique for fashioning plaster cast. To date, 104 have been made. 14 were examined in the new research for Dr. Mitnick. One of the most surprising revelations about Pompey's residents was their genetic diversity, which highlighted the cosmopolitan nature of the Roman Empire in the period. She attributed that to migration, slavery, conquest, and commerce, and at the time of the disaster, the empire's trade routes extended from North Africa to Asia and moved people to Rome by choice and by force. Some of those from whom we were able to generate genome-wide data showed a more Eastern Mediterranean-like genetic ancestry, which could match populations, for example, from the Aegean or from the Levant, said Dr. Mitnick. So they might be either recent migrants or the descendants of migrants from those regions. One of the biggest takeaways for Dr. Reich is that the visually reconstructing the past is unreliable and sometimes fanciful. That a valuable lesson is to learn when making measurements of how people are related to each other based on DNA or their molecular sex, he said. I think this teaches us some humility and skepticism about our interpretations. Bobby Allison, one of the all-time great NASCAR drivers, has died at age 86. Bobby Allison, who won 85 NASCAR races over an almost 3-decade career that made him one of the most celebrated stock car drivers of all time in the sport, died on Saturday. He was 86. Racing wasn't always kind to Allison. He lost both of his sons in two tragic NASCAR incidents, while his own career ended after a near-fatal on-track accident in 1988. The Florida native currently holds 4th place on NASCAR's all-time Premier Series win list, and his 336 top 5 finishes are second only to fellow Hall of Famer Richard Petty. Allison also made 718 career starts, and the 14th highest in series history. He won the prestigious Daytona 500 3 times, 1978, 82, and 88. The Southern 500 at Darlington Raceway 4 times, 71, 72, 75, and 83, and was also a 3-time winner of the Coca-Cola 600 at Charlotte Motor Speedway, 71, 81, and 84. Born Robert Arthur Allison on December 12, 1937, in Miami, Florida, he became part of the so-called Alabama Gang, alongside his brother Donnie and veteran modified racer Red Farmer, and when the group moved to Hueyton, Alabama, where they dominated the short track scene, Allison began his full-time Premier Series career in 1966. In 1979, Allison was credited with helping bring NASCAR wider fame around the United States, while he and his brother Donnie hit the national headlines when they fellow racer Cale Yarborough at the Daytona 500. Allison was also who had an affable persona, was named NASCAR's most popular driver 6 times, but he had to wait until he was 45 to finally capture the full NASCAR crown in 1983. One of the highlights of his career came when he won the 1988 Daytona 500 at the age of 50, holding off a charge from his son Davey, who came in second. Later that year, a crash at the Chronicle Mountains in Long Pond, Pennsylvania, left Allison with broken bones in his left leg, broken ribs, and a concussion. The head injury also left him with gaps in his memory, and the incident ended his NASCAR career as a driver. Not long afterwards, both of Allison's 2 sons tragically died in a NASCAR-related accidents. In 1992, Clifford Allison died at the age of 27, in 1992, of injuries sustained in a crash during practice at the Michigan International Speedway. The next year, Davey was killed after crashing his helicopter while attempting to land at Talladega Superspeedway in Alabama. He was 36. As well as his 2 sons, Bobby Allison had 2 daughters, Bonnie and Carrie, with his wife Judy, who he married in 1960. The couple divorced in 1996 following the death of their sons, but reunited at a wedding and remarried before Judy's death in 2015. Bobby Allison personified the term racer, though he was best known as one of the winningest drivers in NASCAR's Cup Series history. His impact on the sport extends far beyond the record books, NASCAR chairman and CEO Jim France said in a statement. As a driver, he won races and championships across several NASCAR divisions, but as the leader of the famous Alabama Gang, Bobby connected with fans in his profound manner. In the most significant ways, he gave his all to our sport. On behalf of the France family and all of NASCAR, I offer my deepest condolences to Bobby's family, friends, and fans on the loss of NASCAR's giant. 13 states will have women governors next year, a new record. A record number of women will serve as state governors next year, building on the historical gains made during the 2022 election. A new record came after Republican Kelly Ayotte, a former U.S. Senator and State Attorney General, won the New Hampshire governor race on Tuesday, defeating Democrat Joyce Craig in what was considered this year's most competitive gubernatorial election. Ayotte's victory will bring the total number of women holding state governors' offices to 13, surpassing the previous high of 12 set after elections in 2022. Before that, the highest number of women serving as governor was 9, at record established in 2004. We are both celebrating the milestones that women have achieved, but at the same time, we know that those milestones, we also have to recognize that there's a lot of progress left to make for women, said Kelly Dittmar, a director of research at the Rutgers University Center of American Women in Politics. And that is especially true at the gubernatorial level, she added. 2 black women will serve together in Senate for the first time. Governors in particular play a major role in shaping state policies that often can have more immediate and direct impact on their citizens than federal policies. When women are elected into office, it tends to promote more trust in government and better perceptions around fairness, Dittmar said. Because it holds up to that standard of being representative, she said. That's the message. Dittmar added that while women in office are far more monolithic in their positions or priorities, they have historically been the force behind raising issues and policy agendas around caregiving, women's inclusion in medical trials, and concerns about the treatment of women in the military. Seeing women in office also sends a positive message to young women about what's possible for them in the future, and for young men, will they see that they hold less biases about who can and should be in elected leadership, Dittmar said. Next year, Ayotte will join the group of female governors already in office: Kate Ivey of Alabama, Kate Hobbs of Arizona, Sarah Huckabee Sanders of Arkansas, Kim Reynolds of Iowa, Laura Kelly of Kansas, Janet Mills of Maine, Maura Healey of Massachusetts, Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, Michelle Lujan Grisham of New Mexico, Katie Hochul of New York, Tina Kotek of Oregon, and Kristi Noem of South Dakota. Including Ayotte, 5 are Republicans and 8 are Democrats. In the U.S. territories, Lou Leon Gutierrez, a Democrat, has been serving as Guam's governor since 2019. This past week, Republican Jennifer Gonzalez-Colon won Puerto Rico's governor race. Still, 18 states have never elected a female chief executive: California, Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Illinois, Indiana, Maryland, Minnesota, Mississippi, Missouri, Nevada, North Dakota, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, and Wisconsin. This year was not a major election cycle for governors, with only 11 states holding elections. Among them, only 4 included women as leading contenders. Female candidates in Missouri, Indiana, and Vermont, all of whom were Democrats, lost to male opponents. It also coincides with Vice President Harris' unsuccessful bid to become the first female commander-in-chief. Many Democrats say sexism was a factor in Harris' loss. Had Harris won the presidency, Minnesota Lieutenant Governor Penny Flagnan would have taken over as governor for Vice President candidate Tim Walz and would have become the first Indigenous woman to serve as governor in the U.S. That is all for today. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.